Hey everyone, I'm Kate.
And I'm Jim.
And welcome to episode 5 of the Creative Content Studio podcast.
What are we talking about today, Kate?
Well, today, Jim, we are talking about how to plan for your first 10 episodes. So your first season, first series, if you want to call it that. Obviously, it doesn't have to be 10 episodes. There are no rules in podcasting, but that's a nice round number.
Yep.
And it gives you a good start. So, so ideally, kind of what's the ideal way to plan those first 10 episodes? What would you suggest? Obviously, a lot of it can be improv. And again, there's no rules, but it requires a certain element of planning, right? When you're starting out with a podcast. So where do you start?
Well, I think your format's going to help you in the first instance decide on kind of the season structure, if there's going to be seasons, whether it's going to be kind of evergreen, episodic, it's going to come out every week, every month, every whatever. All of that is going to be decided a little bit by your format. So if you're doing the kind of documentary style, for example, your first 10 episodes might in fact be the entire thing. Mm-hmm. So it depends upon the format.
Yeah.
Why are we talking about 10 episodes, I suppose? There's a stat that goes around in the world of podcasting that 90% of podcasts don't make it to episode 10.
That's a high number.
It's a high number. There's a variety of reasons as to why that happens, but a lot of it is maybe because there isn't that element of forward planning. Perhaps people didn't quite know the extent of the workload that was going to be involved in making the podcast. As we've talked about before, you can make a show quite easily in some ways, depending on how you set it up and that kind of stuff. But some people start off with a very ambitious project and then realise it's not sustainable for their lifestyle, maybe for their technical skill set, maybe for their budget. There's all kinds of reasons. Maybe they just decided they were going to do, one a week, and doing that and fitting that into maybe their day-to-day working life or their home life just isn't a thing. So that's why we've talked about 10 episodes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. And what would you suggest in regards to how far in advance you should record each episode? And again, that probably depends a lot on format as well, and also subject matter, right?
Yeah, so I'll do a little precursor before I talk about that, which is about kind of launch strategy as a wider point, really.
Okay, sure.
And something that's really worth thinking about. So many folks out there will tell you what you need to do is launch with a bunch of episodes. So don't launch with one episode, or don't launch with just a trailer. There's a logic to this, and it makes a lot of sense. Again, there's no rules to this. You don't have to follow this guideline. But I do think there is an advantage to doing it potentially in this way that I'm about to describe. So many people will say what you should do is launch with 5 episodes, launch with 10 episodes, launch with 3 episodes, but a number higher than 1. And the reason being is that in that first kind of few days of your show, particularly the first kind of day, hopefully you've engaged, and we'll talk about promoting your show at the beginning at some point in a future episode, but hopefully you've engaged maybe a mailing list that you've got, or perhaps you've got a really big social media audience that you've engaged around the fact that you're launching this podcast. What you want is for all those people on day 1 to hit follow, subscribe, depending on the channel that they're on, and listen to / download as many of your episodes as possible. So just because my maths isn't great, we'll do simple numbers. So say I've got 100 folks on my mailing.
On your what now?
Say I can't say the word mailing list.
Right.
Say I've got 100 people on my mailing list, okay? And I've told them all I've got a podcast coming out, and I release 1 episode. Then obviously I'm going to get 100 streams if all of those people listen, download, etc., or 100 follows or whatever. Obviously my follower number's not going to change if I release more episodes because it's still 100 people. But what is going to change if I release 3 episodes is I'm going to get 300 plays or 300 downloads and so on. Now, what's going to happen then, depending on the category that your podcast is in, and by category I mean podcasts are divided into genres, which you set. as the podcaster. So it might be that you're under business podcasts. It might be that you're under
lifestyle,
kind of a lifestyle show. It might be that you're under philosophy, society and culture. There's all these different categories. If you release 3 episodes and there's 100 people in your mailing list, you've got 300 plays, that may give you a chance of charting on the Apple Podcast charts. And the Apple Podcast charts are the one that everybody kind of goes by, if you like, when they look at the chart positions. So say you're in, I had a show recently that was in kids and parenting, as it was its category. And we released 3, I think, or might have been 5 on the first day of release. Really engaged this particular podcaster's audience around their mailing list and all the things that I've mentioned, their social media, and therefore got a huge number of downloads based on the fact that there was 5 episodes. And that meant that they charted in the top 10 in kids and parenting within the first couple of days. Mm-hmm. So why is that important? Well, it's important because if you're trying to go to prospective sponsors and sell your show ultimately as a place for them to advertise on, then a top 10 podcast sounds a lot better.
It's impressive, isn't it? It's an
exactly.
impressive stat, yeah.
So thinking about that can change, going back to our original subject, thinking about that kind of strategy around launch can change your need to be planned and prepared when it comes to getting your content ready for release. So you may have to almost prepare a launch strategy. In fact, you should prepare a launch strategy to start with, and then think about what your sort of evergreen sustainable strategy is after that when it comes to preparing your content. So it might be, okay, I need to go really quick to get 5 episodes ready. Then I need to settle into a fortnightly rhythm, and what does that look like in terms of my life? So your podcast, and when we talk about sustainability, there may be, as there is when you launch anything, a huge amount of work at the beginning because you've got to get maybe 5 episodes ready, and then it can slow into its kind of usual cadence, if you like.
Okay.
So that's a big caveat to all of this, is launch strategy is kind of a separate element to this, but I would generally, if you're asking for a bit of advice on that, just here, we will dive into it in a bit more detail, but launch with more than 1 episode ultimately. Mm-hmm. And I've seen lots of shows that haven't done that, and it's absolutely fine, and they've still grown really successful shows.
Goes to show, doesn't it? Yeah, it depends on a few variable factors.
Yeah, they've grown successful shows. My own show, for example.
Yeah, you didn't do that.
I didn't do that. I launched with 1 episode, and then I went every week, and I launched an episode every week.
Consistency was your key.
Consistency was the key, and lots of really good guests, and we ended up charting regardless of that strategy, just through weight of numbers that we were charting in that position fairly regularly. So yeah, and the only other thing I'll say on this, and like I said, we will talk about this in a future episode, but is the podcast charts that Apple produce are not cumulative downloads, etc. So what I mean by that is you don't always see the biggest shows at the top every single week because they just have a sheer volume of downloads, over the course of time. It's based on a whole variety of things, which Apple says on their website for podcasters. We don't tell you exactly what goes into it, but it's a mixture of reviews, engagement with the show, so amount of the show that was listened to by your audience, number of plays, etc., etc. So it's a kind of it's a whole set of different metrics that they're looking at and putting those together into popularity of a show, and it is like a daily kind of ever changing thing. So a show that's, if you just release an episode and that episode gets really popular, you can chart that day, and then the next day, because the downloads start to drop off, you might fall out of the charts then and then go back in and out. So
okay.
What that means is it's kind of democratized in a way. It means that if you're in a category where you're up against some big names, you still have a chance. It doesn't mean that you're
which is good in a way. It means you're not going to lose out to Fern Cotton necessarily in the lifestyle category or whatever she's in, society and culture.
Yeah,
every
exactly.
time.
Exactly that, yeah. So obviously that you're talking about sort of batch recording your first sort of
few episodes maybe to release all at once, and that was going to be a follow-up question, was would you advise batch recording or week to week? But I suppose maybe if you need to, strategy planning, you need to maybe do a bit of batch recording to get the first few out, if that's a good piece of advice to follow. That's what people want to do. But then after that, you need to plan in to make it either once a week, once a month, or consistent. Or should you batch record, like, if you've got enough content, I guess, like 20 in advance, and then you can just release as and when. Again, it depends on a lot of factors, time, your life, how you can build it around. It all links back to that sustainability element, doesn't it?
So the first thing is obviously your topic and your content is going to decide some of this for you. So if your show's really topical, then obviously you can't batch record in the same way that somebody whose content is not evergreen, not topical, is evergreen and is not topical.
I know what you meant.
They can batch record it to a different degree than somebody who's doing a news podcast or something that's based on latest film releases and things like that. Then you're kind of, you're stuck with that. But if you're, say, somebody who's a business coach, as an example, and you're teaching business lessons through your podcast, or you're interviewing the great and the good from your world of business, those lessons might be evergreen, and therefore you can batch record as much as you like. There's a little caveat that I'll put into this. So as a general rule, yes, batch recording's great. What you don't want to be is on the kind of hamster wheel of pressure when it comes to a podcast, because that's a surefire way to be quitting before episode 10.
Yeah.
I put myself, when I started my show, under a huge amount of pressure.
You did.
By saying I'm going to release one every week, and not having any guests lined up for episode 2. So
sometimes a bit of a scramble. I
learned from bitter experience that can be a hard road, and you can get through it. I got through to 200 plus. I'm still going. You can get through that, of course, but it does mean that you are on a constant cycle of, right, I need an episode for next week. I haven't got a guest lined up. What am I going to do? I'm reaching out to different people and so on.
I suppose that is, sorry to interrupt, but that is, again, refers back to what your format is. If it's a solo show, you might be able to batch record quite easily. If you've got something that you're an expert in, a subject that you can talk about, and then chop up into different episodes, then that's one thing. But if you're an interview set up and you actually do need a different guest, then that might not only kind of dictate how often or how frequently you release, but also when you can record, because it relies on other people's calendars.
Yeah, precisely. Exactly that. So you can find yourself scuppered, not just purely because you can't get somebody to line up, and that happens.
But you might get 2 in a week, so you could do 2 in a week, and then you've got them ready for release.
Exactly. So if you can batch record in advance and get yourself into a kind of a positive cycle with it, where you're like 3 or 4 ahead, then that's always going to be helpful. It's going to take some of the pressure off, and it's going to make things a bit more sustainable for you. So I would advise it. This is my caveat that
Sorry, I did.
No. It was me rambling on. But the caveat to it is this: when you start your show, particularly if you're sort of DIYing your show, what you can find is that naturally you get better at things with time. And as you get better at things with time and you research more things, then you'll improve something. Maybe you realise that the setting that you've got your mic set to is not perhaps the best. Maybe you realise that you could do something a bit better with your room, going back to last week when we were talking about your room being more important than your mic.
It's a bit of trial and error, incremental improvements. Yeah.
And if you're batch recording in a very short period of time, sometimes you don't feel the benefit of those lessons.
That's a very good point.
Because you leave no time in between
to learn.
To learn. There was times in my show's history at the very beginning where I made all sorts of errors about where I was recording and how I was recording, in terms of the tech, in terms of the room. And not just that, but in terms of my style as an interviewer. I learned as I went. Now, if I'd recorded 10 episodes up front, yes, I would have probably felt a bit better about my release schedule, but I wouldn't have had the same time to kind of reflect on the interview, listen to it, maybe get some feedback from the audience and adapt as I went. So there are some hidden benefits to not being organised.
Yeah, absolutely. Sort of final question. What are some strategies that you can sort of suggest for coming up with ideas consistently as well? So obviously once you've got your initial few episodes recorded for release, and then going forward you're releasing on a consistent basis, then how do you strategize making sure you got some content to talk about every week or every month or whatever?
Well, your format's going to help you with this. If you're interviewing, in a way, your guests are the content. So that's one of the beauties of doing an interview show. There's always a story to be told through the guest. So that's one of the huge benefits. If your show's topical, it's about reviewing a thing that comes out on a regular basis. Again, your content is going to be sort of set for you.
Yeah.
If your content isn't like that, and it's more, maybe you're doing a solo show and it's about business advice as an example, then yes, you are going to have to come up with different ideas to, different things to talk about. And so, one of the things that you can do in that space, particularly as you get a bit of an audience, but is start to ask your audience what it is that they want.
Okay.
Pay close attention to other creators in your space. What is it that they're doing? What are the kind of general conversations that are going on within that world? And this is where, even if your show doesn't feel like it's topical, you might end up being a bit topical. I've had this with many shows that I've produced over the years, where we have a release schedule for the next 4 or 5 months maybe, and we're all planned in for episodes on a weekly basis. And then something happens in that person's world, in the kind of community that they exist within, where they think, actually, I should make a podcast that talks about that particular subject. So let's drop one in to our schedule here. So you want to allow a little bit of flexibility for that. But talk to your audience, pay attention to your community, see what's out there, and then just be creative with the content and try different things, and see how they land.
Is it a bit more, maybe it's for the more data stat driven people, but be worth looking back maybe on which of your previous episodes have got more views or more listens, because that might be dictated by the particular subject that you might have touched upon, or like an area that's quite maybe topical or of the moment, or that's interesting to people. And maybe, I'm not saying necessarily you want to repeat ideas, but could you maybe expand on that if that's something that's done well before? I
think that's a fantastic point, is use the analytics that are available to you. Your podcast hosting site will have some analytics.
It's not for everyone. That's not the be all and end all either, and a lot of people don't do it for that reason. But it's there if you want it.
No, and if you've got a particular, a story to tell, it's a documentary about something historic, or a real life event that went on, and you've got a story to tell about that, then that's going to play out as it's going to play out. But I would say, even if you're not really a numbers person, you're not data driven, if you're trying to make your podcast successful, if it's not purely just a bit of fun, if it's more than a hobby, or even if it is a hobby and you want to be good at it, then look at your analytics, and what you'll find in most cases, most podcast hosting sites will show you the engagement as a period of time throughout your episode.
Oh, okay.
Try to explain that a bit better, but
no, I know what you mean.
Yeah, so they will show you when listeners dropped off.
That's really interesting to know, isn't it? Yeah.
Now that is really interesting data to look at, and when you start to stack up episodes, you might not be able to see much in the early days, but when you start to stack up a little body of work and build a bit of a listener base, you will start to see, okay, so people really dropped off on that episode about 15 minutes in, whereas on this episode they went the full distance. When I get a guest on that talks about this subject, I have huge numbers. When I have a guest on that talks about that subject, not so much. And also, you've got to be self-critical about that as well. Was that the guest or the content? Was that the questions you asked?
Well, I was about to say it could depend on if you're asking, because some people have like a strategy or a format within like an interview podcast where they ask the same question you did with yours, at the beginning or at the end. But then if they've got like a certain set of questions they ask throughout, maybe some of the answers aren't getting the engagement that you were hoping for. Maybe your kind of format needs a bit of tweaking.
Yeah, and also think about the edit. This is the importance of the edit. Was it actually that there was good content within your show, but you maybe buried it in some less good content?
Yeah. And
so people didn't stick around. So, maybe edit it a little bit more, be a bit more critical of the content. There's a world famous podcaster called Roman Mars, and he presents a show called 99% Invisible, one of my favourite podcasts ever. It's fantastic. It's quite nerdy, but it's fantastic.
Oh, that's you.
Thank you.
In the nicest possible way. It's a compliment.
Yeah, so it's about the everyday design within our world. So essentially that everything is designed around us and 99% of it is invisible. We don't think about it being designed. Why is it the way it is? Why did, it sounds silly, but why did curbsides end up with the particular design that they've got on them, apart from practicality and so on?
As a follow-on from this, just FYI, there is also a book called Invisible Women, which then, as a follow-on from that, proves that all this sort of stuff in the world was designed for men and around men.
That's a fantastic book, by the way.
Very good book, very interesting. But anyway, sorry.
Very interesting. But yes, you are right. The world of design.
Just for the women out there.
The world of design is littered with misogyny for sure.
Unfortunately, so.
But so yeah, you're absolutely right to raise that point. But yeah, so this podcast goes through all these things. Like one of the episodes, for example, was about that when swearing is beeped out on television.
Yeah. Well,
somebody had to figure out what was the best frequency of sound
for the beep.
Right. And so why did they choose that? And there's a whole episode about
not too high, not too low.
Yeah, why they chose beep. This specific beep sound.
Okay.
And I can't remember the exact details, but it was when I was listening to it, it was very interesting as to why that was the case. So it goes into all of these things. Anyway, Roman Mars, what did he say that's of interest to our subject today? So he said, if you've got 100,000 listeners, and you'd be very
lucky
to get 100,000 listeners, but his show's very, very successful. It's been going a long time. But if you've got 100,000 listeners and you cut out a minute of useless information, you've saved 100,000 minutes of people's time in the world, and that is an amazing service to have done.
I like that.
It's brilliant. So be really critical of the work in the edit. Even if you think, there's podcasts that are 3 hours long and there's podcasts that are 2.5 hours long. Okay, yeah, there are, but
should they be?
Is your show really suited to that? That works for a show that's supposed to be like that. It's supposed to be a long rambling thing, and it's designed like that, and it's also designed for people to not listen to in one go. It's probably 2, 3, 4 chunks throughout the course of a week. So there's lots of different subjects within it and they meander through. Okay, that's fine. But if your show's starting out, those first 15 minutes of an episode are really crucial to keeping people there. So are those first 15 minutes representative of the quality throughout the episode? If minute 52 is incredible, but I've got to sit through 51 other minutes that are not so incredible to get there, is that worth my time as a listener?
And that's where people might start dropping off before they get to the good bit.
Yeah, so look at your analytics, be self-critical. Is it the guest? Is it the questions? Is it the format? Is it the sound quality? We talked about things being passable last week. What is it that is causing people to drop off? And you might not know exactly, because it's not as if your listeners are going to give you a completed survey at the end as to why they dropped off. But you might start to spot trends and patterns as you go throughout it. And if you've got some folks within your circle who you're lucky enough to give you that honest feedback, then put it in front of people and say, what did you think of this episode?
Yeah, that's a good idea. Get other people's opinions.
And as you build an audience, you'll find that you can ask them.
Fresh sets of ears and eyes if you're recording it. I know I said that was the final question, but I thought of another one. But obviously we've talked about this as sort of your first season or series, as it was, talking about like a batch of 10 episodes. Is there like a finite number of episodes? Again, I know this is going to be like it depends on a load of things, but like good series of certain shows that you watch, like sometimes you think, they should have just stopped after season 2 because it just dropped off after that. I can think of a few, but I won't mention them. Again, does it depend on how sustainable it is for you? If you think there's enough content in the subject you're talking about. If it's topical, you could go on forever, because obviously things will always raise up in the news and whatever, or in your space of whatever you're talking about. But I just didn't know if there was any sort of guidance around that, or is it just literally, out of feeling and how you think things are going and how successful it is?
Yeah, I think it's exactly that. You've got to let the content and your aims with the podcast guide you on that.
Yeah.
What was your aim with this show in the first place? Was it to have a successful podcast? Was it to get 10 social media clips to promote your business every week?
Yeah.
If it was the latter, and those are only two obviously aims, but if it was the latter and you're still achieving that after 50 episodes without a break and you're fine to keep doing it, then great. If it's still hitting the achievement that you wanted it to hit, perfect. If your aim is to, deliver the most, sharply honed documentary series going, is 50 episodes the way to go? I don't know. Your content's going to have to be the king with that. But series versus episodic versus weekly, monthly, release schedules.
Weekly, yeah.
It's totally up to you. There's some shows that do 10 minutes a day. There's some shows that do once a month. Yeah. There's some shows that I still listen to and I wouldn't advise it. I talked about in previous episodes that release whenever they feel like it.
Yeah. I know, yeah.
And I wouldn't rely on that as a strategy. That's not a good strategy. Not
unless you're at a point where you think that people will still follow.
No.
Along with that. But,
no, then you're doing it for fun, really, and it's a passion project when you've got time.
Which, I guess, like you say, it goes back to what your initial aim and idea of the podcast to be in the first place. So
I'd say my advice on all of that is just think about it.
Yeah, before you start.
Yeah, just spend some time thinking about it and strategizing and researching other shows before you commit to any of those things. Like you can put out there a kind of a flippant, every week we'll do this show. Will you? Should you? Answer those questions before you do it, and then perhaps you won't end up disappointing an audience to begin with. Like that show that I was talking about that just releases on whatever schedule they like. If I'd known that at the beginning, I would be prepared for that and I wouldn't be disappointed.
Yeah.
I think I was disappointed with that show because they released a bunch in quick succession and I felt like we were on a fortnightly run and then they just stopped doing it. And I kept it as one of my subscribed shows, one of my followed shows, and just on the off chance, ever in hope. And a couple of months later, they popped an episode out, and then another 2 weeks later, they popped one out, and then it was another 3 months later. So it was all over the place. If I'd known that at the beginning, I wouldn't have been disappointed as an audience member. But because they got off to a certain rhythm, and then they changed that rhythm, probably because it wasn't sustainable. Because they were making a documentary style and that was really difficult to pull together, I could understand. They then have created a great audience that love their work and then they've had to disappoint them. So start with the kind of end in mind, start with the goal in mind. Where do you want this show to be in a year's time? And if the answer to that question is I don't want it to be a show in a year's time. I just want to have 5 episodes and they do this job. Brilliant. If your answer is I want 8 shows in a quick succession and then I want to take a break, plan for the next season, do one season a year, that's fine too. Just be clear with yourself and with your audience as to what it is you're going to do.
Take them with you. Cool. Okay. I think that's a good place to end.
Super.
Okay.
What shall we be talking about next week?
So about branding next week. So name, artwork and catchy intro, title, that sort of thing. So yeah, all the good stuff.
All the good stuff.
That's all good.
It's all good stuff. Well, have a glorious week.
Have a good Easter weekend as well, everybody.
Have a cracking Easter weekend.
I like we did that.
Oh, I didn't mean to do that. So this comes out Easter Monday.
Yes, it will.
So people
so we would have already done 2 days, 3. I can't count.
In that case, I hope you had a cracking Easter.
I hope you had a lovely Easter weekend. Stop saying cracking.
I hope you had a
like
great
a dad joke.
It is. I hope you had a great Easter weekend.
Have an excellent weekend. Goodbye.
See you next time.